The union of soul and body is enacted at every instant in the movement of existence. This is a quote by Marcel Merleau-Ponty, who was one of the grandfathers of the philosophy of phenomenology. And to me, this is the perfect quote, or what I've taken from a larger quote, about the intertwining of the soul and the body, and the soul and the body with everyday life. In this session, I'm going to take you through some of the philosophy of phenomenology, but mainly through a research study that I did using phenomenology with a group of children with disabilities. So to start with, phenomenology is about capturing lived experience. So some of the examples of this are being elderly and losing one's driving license, and how does that feel, and how does that change your life, and what does that mean to your identity and your independence, all of those things. So the lived experience of that act of losing your driving license. Being a child with a disability and friendships at school, and being a child with a disability who is bullied at school. Now these two studies were taken from that larger study that I did talking with children with disabilities, and the one about friendships can be found in the last year's Canadian Journal of Occupational Therapy, and it's by Rachel Morrison and myself, and Rachel was one of my honours students. And being a child with a disability who is bullied at school and the sorts of supports that children draw on was a study that was done by another student of mine called Susanna Burke, and that article is has just recently been published, so in 2010, in the journal Disability and Society. So for these children, they talked about what these experiences meant to them. Another one that's of certainly general interest with the ageing population is about being in chronic pain, which is true certainly for people with arthritis and people who've had spinal cord injuries, but also people who have neuropathies, who have cancers, who have all sorts of conditions that all of us interact with during our clinical practice. And a study can be talking to these people about what that is like for them. Now, the philosophy of phenomenology, just to give you a brief background on the sort of people who are involved, and this is just so that you can go and chase them up if you're interested. There was a German phase which was from about the mid-1800s to about the mid-1900s, and there were two fellows, Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger. Then there was a French phase, so that was from around these fellows were sort of late 1900s, so fairly recently, and Marcel Marceau and Gabriel Marcel, I'm going off on a complete tangent, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who's the fellow that the quote is from, Jean-Paul Sartre, which philosophers and students of psychology should know about, and Paul Ricoeur, who died recently and is also one of my favourites. So if you want to chase some of this up and learn more about the philosophy of phenomenology, these are the most important people for. Now, Husserl and Heidegger, just to give you a little bit more of an idea of the philosophy that they developed, they talked about essence And this is about the true meaning of a phenomenon. So when you take off all the layers, what is the actual essence of this experience or this act that somebody is talking to you about? And intuiting is about the interpretation of what is meant in the description of the phenomenon. So the essence of an experience is obviously varied. So someone's experience of illness is very different to everybody else's experience. So it's very individualistic. So it's finding the essence for that individual. Now, intuiting is about resulting in a common understanding of the phenomenon, and doesn't mean common in terms of in relation to a group of people, but common between what the person is telling you and what you understand and interpret and then share with others. So that's about you as the researcher giving an accurate interpretation of what someone has told you, of that essence. Now, phenomenological reduction is that ability to return to original awareness regarding the phenomenon. So it's about, again, taking off, if you think about an onion, taking off the layers of an onion to find the core. So what is the original awareness? If you take away your beliefs and assumptions and all sorts of societal governing principles, what is the original awareness? And that there needs to be, to do that, there needs to be a suspension of belief, or what is commonly known as bracketing. Now, this is very particular to phenomenology, but is certainly used by other methodologies. So bracketing is where you, as a researcher, suspend your beliefs. So it means that, again, all your values, your preconceptions, your assumptions, your understandings, all of those you try to make conscious and put to one side. And the best way to do that as a researcher is to write them down, is to sit there and just get lost in, what you know is that stream of consciousness that people talk about, and you write, because it's not for anybody else to see. It's just so every politically incorrect thought that you might have about a particular type of person, let's say like a child with a disability, then you would write down all your conceptions about childhood, about being a child, about how children are perceived, about your understandings of children. And being a child with a disability, it would be about what you understand of disability and your assumptions about children and people in general with disability. So all of those belief systems that you carry, both personal and professional, it's about becoming aware of them as much as is possible and understanding that they're there, but also trying to put them to one side, so bracketing them off from your interpretation of the data. Now, obviously, you can't do that completely, but you will do that to the very best of your ability. Friends, here we go, developed the thoughts around embodiment or being in the world. So this is about lived experience. So there is an embodiment of happiness, and if you look at the background picture to these slides and this child's face, it's an embodiment of happiness. So how does the body show happiness, and how does it get acted out by a human being? And I think you would probably all agree that that is what this child is showing. Being in the world is a term coined by Merleau-Ponty, and by this he means that we are all in the world. We are never separate from it. So you and I are always intertwined with the world. So that means with our physical environment, our sensory environment, our emotional environment, so with other human beings and animals, and how we respond to our physical environment. All of those things, there is an intertwining of those between us and the world, a being in the world. Now, logical view considers that a person has a world, so that we all have a culture, a society, a history, and a language. Now, the world that people live in, their own particular world, can often be overlooked or taken for granted. But a person can only be understood in the context of their lives. And if you think about doing, let's say, a placement in a very busy hospital, often that very individual world is overlooked because there's not time to get to know the person's world very well. You know, you just need the bare bones of it to help people make decisions or to make recommendations for them. But in phenomenology, that world and the person's position in that world and how they relate to the world and how the world relates to them is extremely important. So it is foregrounded. So the person has an ability to make interpretations about knowledge. So knowledge may be presented in whatever form, but each of us has an ability to make interpretations about that knowledge, and that understanding that we gain becomes part of us. So it becomes part of our beliefs or assumptions or preconceptions. Understanding gained becomes part of the self, and that the person is embodied. So, as I mentioned for the little girl in the background of these slides, embodiment is the way we experience the action of ourselves in the world. So it's the physical action and cognitive action of ourselves in the world. Merleau-Ponty and friends also talked about that the person is in time, that there is a temporality to it, that there is now, there is no longer, and there is not yet. We are in time. To just go through bracketing a little bit more, if bracketing is that process of suspending beliefs and prior assumptions about a phenomenon, and it's about examining attitudes, beliefs and prejudices, it's about trying to remove them from influencing the research. So it can be that influence of setting up your questions that you want to ask someone, because there are, depending on your prejudices, there may be things that you won't ask people where you should have, or that would have been incredibly valuable if you had. So that therefore your prejudices or your beliefs or assumptions have already influenced your research, because they have cut off some of the questions or topics of inquiry that you may have had with people. But bracketing should also be constant and ongoing. So that ability to be reflective about yourself, which you need as a health practitioner, you also need as a phenomenological researcher. So it's about, are my beliefs, while I'm interviewing someone, are the sorts of responses I'm giving, the sorts of things I'm talking with them about, are they being influenced by my assumptions about this person? When I sit down and look at the transcripts or listen to the interviews again, am I making assumptions about what I'm hearing? So you keep doing it. When you sit there and you've written your first level of analysis, this is what I understand of what they've said, again, are you making assumptions? They're questions you just need to keep asking yourself and need to keep examining. And this means you'll end up with much better research that more closely represents what people have told you, so the essence of the phenomenon. Now, an ontological perspective, ontology is about being and about being in the world, so that embodiment and that intertwining of self and world. So there's a quote by Munhall which says, "Embodiment explains that through consciousness one is aware of being in the world, and it is through the body that one gains access to this world. One feels, thinks, tastes, touches, hears, and is conscious through the opportunities the body offers." It's about being. And if you hear the word epistemology or an epistemological perspective, that's about knowing or forms of knowledge. So they're quite twisty words to say, but they're fairly straightforward concepts to understand. But they sound impressive. Now, hermeneutics is a way or a type of phenomenology. And I'm bringing this up because when the research I'm about to share with you was hermeneutical phenomenology. So I just want you to understand basically what hermeneutics is. Now, hermeneutics originally came from people reading religious texts, so they would be scholars or monks or novice priests or whoever, or I guess very learned priests. So it was about them sitting down, reading a passage, let's say from the Bible, and then reflecting on it. So thinking about what they had read and interpreting the meaning of that in everyday life and what that meant to them and their understanding of life, and then going back to that text and reading it again with that knowledge and again reinterpreting. So there ended up being a hermeneutic circle going from the reading, so the text in the Bible or whatever manuscript it was, through to the person's cognitive interpretation of that and philosophical interpretation, more importantly, and then back through the text again, back to reading the text and a further interpretation. So that's the hermeneutic circle, if you come across that. And it is about reflexivity. So it's still about, hermeneutics is about looking at or listening to, in my case, the words of children, plus what I read in terms of theory and philosophy, and then going back to each of those and forming a bigger circle. So to the literature, to my understanding of that, back to the literature, is that what I'd read or was there more to it, and going from the literature and my understandings of that to what the children had said and interpreting that, and then going, so having circles within circles ending up. So hermeneutic phenomenology. Now the research that I did was called Reflections on Being, and it was about exploring spirituality within children's narratives of identity and disability. And I chose to do this because I'd been a paediatric OT for probably 20 years by this stage, and I had seen children who had, significant disabilities but powered through life, and just impressed me with their resilience and with their strength of character and their brightness and their courage and all of those things, just amazing kids. But also seeing kids who might have the same type of disability or the same level of disability, who struggled and who just wanted the world to go away. which included me as the therapist and any toys I had with me. So even if there were good things involved, or it was other kids, they just wanted to be left alone. The world was just too hard to deal with. Their disability was too hard to deal with. And what made the difference between these extremes of children? So what could I learn about kids who were very resilient, had very strong identities, and dealt with their disability in a very positive way? Not saying they didn't have moments where that wasn't true, but overall they were like that. How could I learn from those kids to then take those lessons and help the kids who were really struggling and much more vulnerable? Because I knew all the skills and techniques, I was very, very good at what I did, but there was still more to know to be able to be effective with children. So that was the reason for doing this. So the Canadian model of occupational performance talked about spirituality, and the Australian occupational performance model talked about spirit. So it was coming up in the profession as well, and in a quite a central way, because they were coming up in models of practice. And 10 years ago, people were saying, spirituality is crucial to understanding the child and his or her occupational performance. But trying to pin down what spirituality was, what does it look like, and what do you do with it, that was another matter. So I started to have a look at what spirituality was. So there was essence. If you think about why I chose phenomenology, there was essence. It was about meaning in life. It was about the lived expression. There were also texts that talked about there being a source. So it could be God, or it could be Allah, or it could be Yahweh, or it could be some other deity, and that there could be other divinities who were guides in people's lives. So having a source and a guide was obviously strong, particularly in theological texts, but across all of them, whether they were theological or purely philosophical, there were an essence, a meaning, and a lived expression. So it tied very closely with phenomenology. And what I kept coming across were spiritual qualities. So, and these were common across different religions and different philosophies, and whether things were contemporary psychology or whatever, but they were what people considered to be spiritual qualities. Now, I can get into discussions with psychologists about these, but for the purpose of my study, this is what I took from all that literature. These were not, and this is not exclusive, but these were a number of spiritual qualities. And then I looked at how were they embodied. So if you have something like hope, courage, how is that embodied? And that's when I started to come up with resilience and agency and self-esteem, meaning. So purpose gave rise to meaning. There are all sorts of things, playfulness, and I'm thinking about children, and I'm thinking about how they might embody those qualities that would help them be resilient. So if you have hope, and you have courage, and you have trust, and you have faith, and you have a sense of belonging and a purpose, you're probably going to be fairly resilient. So these were the things I was interested in. These is what was coming up in the research. Now, in terms of children's spirituality, research-wise, it was usually religious, to be expected. So if I took religion to be an expression of spirituality, but an expression of, so that a way people could do this, but spirituality to me, or the way I chose to position it, was within these qualities of hope, courage, faith, blah, blah, blah. So there was some research out there on children with life-threatening illnesses, and particularly the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So she also looked at children who were dying and have done some amazing work in that area. Children with chronic illnesses, there was some, particularly in the nursing literature, and children who were hospitalised. So there was some out there, often with a prayer or other religious focus, but there was some out there. There were some common themes that came up about hope and about meaning. My research chose to look at the lived experience of kids with disabilities. So it was their experience of purpose and how they sustained and developed their sense of self, and how did they determine and express choice. So there's your resilience and there's your agency. So this was the focus of my research. Now the theoretical base that I chose, and I looked obviously across theology, psychology, philosophy, sociology, disability studies, whatever I could lay my hands on, became part of my theoretical base. So it was very broad. And I was interested in being and interested in knowing, so interested in ontology and epistemology. I used ecological theory, and this is Yuri Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory, because it's about the influence of the world on the child and different sorts of relationships influencing the child. But Bronfenbrenner's later work also looked at how does the child influence their world, and that to me was just as important. And I was interested in that lived experience. So what happened? I ended up with 18 children with different sorts of disabilities or impairments. So these kids some had cerebral palsy, there was a girl with spina bifida, there were a couple of kids with visual impairments and hearing impairments. There was one child with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There was a girl who had meningococcal disease and had lost a number of fingers and toes and had extensive scarring on her body and limbs. There was a child who'd had an atrioventricular mass removed from her frontal lobe, so she had an acquired brain injury. I think that just about covers them all. So there was a real mix of kids. They were all between the ages of 8 and 11, because I wanted those sort of older primary school kids. They lived either somewhere in New South Wales, so there were kids, from the centre of Sydney out to remote areas of New South Wales, and there were a couple of kids from the ACT, so urban, suburban, rural and remote, different sorts of family groupings, as in, single parent, two parents, whether it was single parent, whether, some with mum, some with one child with dad, different numbers of siblings or no siblings, and of cousins, and of, relations, and how often they saw, so all sorts of things. Socioeconomic status, there was from a boy who lived in housing commission in Sydney's western suburbs to a lad who went to a private school in Sydney, and the parents had a very large boat in the front yard of their North Shore home. So great range in that. In terms of ethnicity, the kids were all Australian, but a number of them had parents who were first generation Australian and their parents had come from Malta or Singapore or South America, as well as there being Caucasian Australian kids. As far as I knew, there were no Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander kids. And in terms of schools, so it was from public schools to private to special school. So a really great range of kids. Now, the methods that I used were narrative, conversation. So think back to narrative inquiry. So I was asking the children to tell me stories, but we had a conversation. So it wasn't just one way. So they asked me for stories as well. And I shared stories with them about myself and being a kid. I chose to do in-depth, semi-structured interviews. I saw most kids probably 4 or 5 times. There was, I think, only one child I saw 3 times, and I'd planned for 3, but for most kids I saw more than that, and that was their choice. So how long it took, which was anything from an hour to 3 hours really, depending on how much play we did and how much we had to talk about and what other things we did in the middle of it. The kids would ask for me to come back. So we had more to talk about. I came back. We did all that. So while we had our conversations, we played. We did a lot of art and craft, a lot of drawing, painting, making things. The kids were given a disposable camera each, and they were given that the first time we chatted, and that was for them to take photos of people, places or things that were important to them. And why I asked them to do that, and they're all really happy to do so, was so that they remained engaged between interviews, because they'd be out, thinking about photos or taking photos. But it also meant that I could see more of their world, because I saw these kids at home, except for one child. I saw them all at home, and they took photos of things like their favourite place to go, or their bedroom, or their books, or friends, or family people, other people in the family. One child took the bus driver who picked her up every day. So I couldn't see all of these people or places, but by the children taking photos, we could sit down and they could tell me a lot more, and people or things that they had told me about, and I then saw photos. So I'm getting that triangulation of data as well, and opportunities or prompts for conversation. So it ended up, and they kept the photos. So it was also a really nice memento. And most of the kids had never had a camera, so all of those good things happened. Mind maps were a particular sort of drawing that we did, and the kids knew them as word worms from school. So we would, let's say, take the word happy and draw that on a piece of art paper, and then spreading out from that, put down all the things that they would put down all the things that made them happy, and I'd be sitting there with my piece of paper and putting down all the things that made me happy. And this also was a way of triangulating the data, but it gave us a shared experience. So I wasn't an adult sitting there doing something to them. We were actually doing things together, and I needed to be honest enough, because if we did things like sad or angry, that I needed to be honest enough to put down, if one of my brothers I was having a fight with, I might put that down, and then we would talk about why we had written down what we'd written. Or some kids drew things, most kids wrote, or if they weren't good drawers, didn't want to draw, and were not great spellers, so were uncomfortable about writing, then I'd just scribe for them. So that was another thing that just made it, one, a lot more fun, but also gave me lots of different ways of learning about, talking to me about. Now, in terms of the process and developing the topics, this happened 2 ways. If I talk about how I came up with the sorts of questions that I did, which were very much everyday type questions, coming up with the topics was deductive and inductive. So what I did was so from the literature, I'd come up with all of these spiritual qualities, and then worked out from the literature, how they're embodied. So, for example, so if belonging is love and belonging are spiritual qualities, so they may be embodied through friendship, through family relationships, through play. You can get a sense of belonging and being connected and being loved. So playing with friends at school, but it's also the opposite of being bullied by kids at school, is certainly an experience of not being loved and not belonging. So that's how I worked out the sorts of topics that I talked to the kids about. So we did it that way. So when I got their stories, let's say, about a friendship at school, then I would be inductive about working out what spiritual qualities came into play in that. So yes, it might have been belonging and love, but there may have been that this friendship with this child gave a certain sense of meaning and therefore purpose to this particular child's life. And there could be a number of other things going on. Okay, so that's how the topics went. So in terms of the thematic analysis from the kids' stories, I used Van Manen. So this is Max Van Manen, who is a phenomenologist. He's at the University of Alberta in Canada and has written a book called Researching Lived Experience, which is in the Huxley Library. And he has, there's a 1990 edition, and there are slightly more recent editions, I think 2001, but the only thing that changed was the foreword. So it really doesn't matter if you get the 1990 version. And it's the process that he uses, because he's a phenomenologist as a researcher. Then the way of doing the thematic analysis is that if I have a transcript, then I will read that transcript in its entirety and think about what stands out for me, and then I will start reading it in sections. So a child and I might start off talking about school, and then we might start talking about friendships, and then we might start talking about bullies, and then we might start talking about the frustrations with adults, or how vulnerable a child might feel. So there might be a number of things that we talk about, and I'll start looking at those in depth, and then I will go back over the transcript yet again, and I'm writing notes this whole time, go over it again and do it sentence by sentence and word by word, look at it in very fine detail. What is this child saying? But also, what have they left out and why? Or if there is a silence, what do I think that silence meant? Now, because I saw the children a number of times, it meant that I could go through one interview or the recording or transcript for an interview in depth before I went back and saw them again. So then I would have some questions about that. And I might ask them the next time, and I'd say, last time you talked about this, did you mean this, or did you mean something else, or whatever? So that was all part of the process, and the hermeneutic engagement was about my engagement with that transcript, and then with the group of transcripts from each child, and then with the transcripts from all of the children. So I had between 3 and 5 per child. I had 18 children who I'd interviewed over probably a 9-month period, 9 to 12-month period, and I ended up with 72 transcripts. Now remember, these transcripts were 1.5 to 2 hours long. Most of them were that long. At least a lot of it was play, so a lot of it didn't even, it was interesting and I needed to pay attention to it, but they weren't the kids telling me stories, but it was part of the flow, so I still needed to pay attention. But that was a lot of information to analyse. but doing it in a very ordered way and doing it from a transcript to a topic within the transcript to the sentence within the topic meant that I had deeper and deeper levels of analysis, which was very important. Now, for this particular research, I ended up with 4 main topics, or 4 main themes really, and I'm going to take you through those. So I ended up with not having spiritual quality after spiritual quality, because that's not the lived experience of it. If it's about being in the world, and if you think about Yuri Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory, it's about yourself and your family. For children, it's then themselves and their school world, and then themselves and the wider world. And again, it was the impact both ways. How for composing the self, it was about their identity. So if you have a disability or something else, then how does that impact on your sense of self? And for some kids it didn't, but for some kids it did. Didn't mean they weren't resilient kids, but it did make a difference to them. So, and where did that come from? Well, that usually comes from society and societal beliefs and the assumptions that people make about kids. So there was a real back and forth about how things were going. So I'm going to take you through, just for interest, each of these. So in composing the self, I had stories of origin, which was a couple of kids talked about when they were born. An alterity of being. Now, alterity is a phenomenological term coined by Merleau-Ponty, and it means basically being different. So, but it doesn't mean being less. Now, you see in the literature, people use other. They were the other, and usually, and it can be other with a capital O, but usually there's an implication that means less than me or less than whoever else they're talking about. But alterity is about being other but not being less. So as one of the kids said, you mean being different but still being special. And I thought that's a beautiful way of putting it. So this is so then there's a section on that. There's about being themselves, being other, being positioned as less or other in a derogatory way, and then them talking about when they grow up. So I'm going to take you through some of their quotes. So Bobby had glaucoma, so he'd lost sight in one eye through glaucoma, and he was in danger of losing sight in his other eye. When I born, I wasn't good, but my parents and God look and care about what was happening, and from that I've been brave and trusting doctors, and I am praying to be okay one day. But for the moment, I am so happy who I am, and I do a lot of things with my family, my dog, and some friends. In the alterity of being, kids talked about renegotiating their identity. So some kids talked about, I might be different, but I'm still just fine, thanks very much, and don't position me as being less than you. So they had a different way of being, but it was still a very full way of being. But some kids certainly did have a hope or a wish for amelioration of their impairment. So Elliot, who had a significant visual impairment, he had cone dystrophy, he said, what I'd wish for is better eyes, no more eye drops, and to be tall and to be healthy. He'd also like full vision. Elvis, oh sorry, that first quote is actually Bobby. The second quote of full vision is Elliot, who had cone dystrophy. For Elvis, who had severe spastic quadriplegia and used an electric wheelchair, he said not being disabled. That's what he wished for. And Rambo, who was his name, they all chose their pseudonyms. I forgot to say that a bit earlier. So Rambo, who certainly chose a very appropriate name, he had spastic diplegia, and his was, and never go to physio again. So selfhood and sameness is about how they understood themselves, how they sought how they sought the sameness in their difference and the sameness in everyday life. So let's have a look at what that means. Groovy Princess had spina bifida, and she had her lower limb on her left leg had finished at about mid-calf, so she had no foot and no ankle and no lower calf. And she would wear a prosthesis. So she's talking about the prosthesis. If later on I can show you my other one, that's what it's pretty good, my other one. It was purple sparkles. She went for prostheses that were really bright. She loved colour, and she loved colour in her prosthesis. So when she was wearing it, it was standing out. She was not hiding the fact that she had an artificial lower limb, part of a lower limb and foot. S007, and he had left hemiplegia. He said, well, one thing I've got to say is that every single person is different. But, I'm the same, that I believe in Jesus, and so does my friend. And I'm different in the ways that I'm not a bully like some kids are, and his friend and me like fishing and playing games. There is nothing in there about his hemiplegia. It's about belief systems, it's about how you treat other people, and it's about the sorts of things he does every day. Nothing to do with his disability. So there is a sameness that is completely separate from that disability. Kids talked about themselves, they talked about being themselves, believing in themselves, and about their needs and others' needs and how they balanced or ignored those. Oh, Brett, who had cone dystrophy. I'm getting very confused. Okay, so Brett said, that's just part of life, I guess, being able to accept who you are and stuff. Yeah, I wouldn't change for someone else. And what sort of person was he? Oh, well, I'd probably just say kind, brave, loving person, I suppose, considerate. And it's probably just heart and soul that I've got to have, I suppose. So he's talking about inner qualities, about who he is and who he needs to be, and most importantly, who he sees himself as. Rambo talked about when I said, can you describe yourself? And he said, man, that is so hard. And then he thought about it and he said, I can't walk and I'm disabled. And that's how he pronounced it. And then I thought, no, I didn't get this right. So I said to him, no, what are you like as a person? And he said, I'm normal. Interesting difference, isn't it? Funny sometimes, enthusiastic, and that's it. And that was true. He was quite very funny, and he was very enthusiastic. But like he said, as a person, he was normal. But to describe himself, he described himself from a physical point of view. Kids also talked about their future occupations, so what they wanted to do when they grew up. often they were an expression of their identity, and there was an intertwining for some kids between their present, the things that were important to them in the present, and what was going to be important to them in the future. So Chantel, who had a cochlear implant, she said, so what do you want to be when you grow up? Like Tinkerbell. But I don't like to be a tooth fairy, though. Then you'd be stuck picking up people's teeth. And she also said, I dream about that. Sometimes I dream about like I'm on stage and I didn't know that my mum was watching me on stage sometimes. Now, I've seen Chantel because I've been back to see some of these kids as adolescents. And in high school, she's just finished high school last year, and while she was in high school, she took up drama, and that's what she still wanted to be, was to be on stage. So even though she has a cochlear implant and she lip reads, she wants to be an actor. So if I had made an assumption, here is a girl who has a cochlear implant, so couldn't possibly think about singing or acting or anything that had to do with hearing, then my assumptions would have cut off the core of what gave her life meaning. So her comments are a very good reason why she should never make assumptions about anyone with any sort of disability. And this was true for a number of these kids, that they chose things, or things were important to them, that if you were being extremely practical, you would say, oh, but you can't do that because you have the particular disability you have. That was irrelevant to them. They had things that had meaning, and they're the things that we need to build on with these kids as well, which is what they taught me. Cheezel, who had bilateral hearing aids, wanted to be an author. I want to be an author because I love reading. I love reading. I read all the time. I seem that I can't even live without reading. So it was like being able to breathe to him, being an author. Now, I also saw again as a youth in the last couple of years, and he took up guitar playing and languages. So he was learning in high school, learning Japanese, and he had self-taught on the acoustic guitar, and he played for me, and it was just beautiful. He was really, really good at it. And I have one brother in particular who's a guitarist, a musician, so I know what I'm listening to. And Cheezel was very good. For someone who was 15, he was very good. So what are the implications for practice out of all this? So the kids have been telling me things, but what does this mean to me as an occupational therapist and a health professional? So the kids taught me about resilience and how they experienced resilience and what helped them to have resilience, which were things like what gave them their life meaning. So being able to read, being able to dance, being able to act, being able to look after pets, all sorts of things gave their life meaning and promoted their resilience. Belonging promoted their resilience. So friendships at school, which a lot of them didn't have, were very important. And their families and pets became even more important if they didn't have those friendships at school. And particularly pets were replaced peers, if that was possible for them. There was a very strong engagement of their spirit with their self. They had very deep understandings of themselves, but also of the world, and they understood why people viewed them as they did. They understood why adults behaved, and I'm talking about behaved as they did, and I mean teachers and therapists and parents. They understood what was happening to them in terms of their disabilities, what the future was looking like in terms of what they could and couldn't do physically or cognitively or sensorially or whatever. They had very clear understandings and insights into themselves. Their stories of identity were at odds with what I professionally had been taught, not necessarily to what I'd learned to understand in practice, but certainly what I'd been taught about children. And they taught me even more, and they certainly taught me that if I wanted to engage with them in a way that was meaningful for them, the bottom line was respect. That's what all of them wanted from adults. They wanted to be respected, which meant that if they had something to say, they needed to be listened to and it needed to be treated with respect. That if there were things that were important for them to do, even if it was difficult for them physically for some reason or sensorially, then they needed to be enabled to do it. And the way that you engaged meaningfully with them was to help them to do that. Help them in the ways that they wanted to be helped, not in the ways you assumed they needed to be helped. So we as health professionals need to pay attention. We need to talk to them about themselves, and we need to pay attention to what they're saying and to treat them with respect. And if those very simple messages came out of all the time that I mean, there was a lot more, but they were the basic bottom line for these guys. If you want to read more about these kids and read more about how I did this study, then there is actually a copy. This was my PhD, so it's 5 years old now, in 2010. If you want to have a look at it, there is actually a copy for some reason in the Central Coast Library. The main copies are held at the University of Sydney because that's where I did the PhD, but there are also some other publications coming out. There are a couple of articles with the honours students, and there are a couple of book chapters coming out as well. And don't read it for my sake, read it because the kids have got great things to tell you. It on Phenomenology. Thank you.